Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist, and today I'm going to speak about transactional analysis, or TA in short, and how we can use TA to understand and raise awareness of how and why we might be reacting to people in certain situations like we do, and also how we can use TA to work towards changing some of these behaviour patterns and better regulating our emotions. So TA suggests that our brain functioning is split up into three ego states, which we call the parent, the adult, and the child. And each of these ego states serves certain purposes that determine how we react to people and situations in the present. So if our ego states are healthy and working in unison, then we're going to have pretty good control over our emotions and behaviors. But if for whatever reason one or more of our ego states is not able to meet its purpose, then our personality style and how we accord ourselves in the world, it's going to reflect this. So this is a big subject in a small video, but hopefully I can make some sense of it for you in a short time. So I'm going to start by explaining the functions of the parent, adult, and child ego states when they're working healthily. Then I'll give you some examples of when they're not working healthily and what might have caused this, and also how we can work towards getting them working more in sync and doing the jobs they're supposed to be doing to keep us emotionally regulated. So when we think of the parent ego state, we think of this as being the part of our process that helps us to parent ourselves, not how we parent others. Not in this example. So if this part's working properly, it's going to be regulating our self-care, our moods, our self-esteem, our behaviors. But it's also going to be managing our impulse control, which is going to keep us from addictions, and it's not going to let us put ourselves in dangerous situations. So in effect, the parent, when it's working healthily, is going to be looking after you like an attuned and caring parent would be. Now, the adult ego state is managed more by our ego functioning, so this differs in that respect, which enables us to prioritize logic over emotions when we react to things. So, if we were to find ourselves in a dangerous or tricky situation when we're in our adult ego state, then we're likely to go to problem solving rather than panic in that situation because our ego is going to prioritize logic over anxiety. It's also the part of our process that polices our life situations so we can make moral and ethical choices, so we act like a grown up. And because the adult's regulated by the ego, it's also going to have access to healthy levels of anger that are going to help us to enforce boundaries with ourselves and others, to stand up for our beliefs, to just feel confident and powerful in the world. It's not the throwing the dolls out the pram type of anger, because that's clearly not adult, but that's a good example of how a different ego state might use anger. And then we have the child ego state, which is where all our emotions are held. And typically, how we developed and coped in childhood tends to influence massively how we respond to things in the present. So the child ego state's the fun part of our personality, and it also harbors all our impulsive behaviors, along with our need to play, learn, be creative, make friends. So all of the stuff that brings joy and relaxation to our life, typically it's all held in the child. So there are some situations, though, in which the healthy adult ego state and the healthy parent ego state might be knocked offline. An example of this would be that if you were involved in a traumatic incident, because when we go into shock, our brain becomes hypersensitive to the belief that the world has suddenly become more dangerous, because of course it has. And it's going to want to stay hypervigilant for a time to help us avoid further catastrophes, which it thinks is likely because one's just happened. So this means that the traumatic event has pretty much thrown us into a hypervigilant child ego state in which all its senses and emotions are now prioritizing threat detection, which means that the parent's capacity to soothe and the adult's capacity to rationally analyze situations are going to have been severely diminished. And this is typically what you'll see if you're working with people with CPTSD or PTSD. So that's how recent trauma might damage our ego states. A good example of how historical or childhood trauma might do the same would be that if you were brought up in a shaming or overly critical environment. And this is because our developing parent ego state, the parent in our child, tends to mirror the type of parenting we receive. So in effect, we learn to parent ourselves the way that we were parented. So if people were critical or shaming towards us as children, then our inner parent is going to see ourselves through that same lens, as that's all we've known, that's what we were told, that's what we've integrated as true, and we believe it's true, so we keep telling ourselves it's true. And typically because of this, the adult ego state in the shamed child is probably not going to have much power because the critical parent's voice is going to be much louder than the voice of logic. So another situation that can result in a child not developing healthy ego states would be when childish behaviours were just not tolerated by the parents, even when those behaviours were age appropriate, which means that the child was not allowed to be a child. Because this can result in the child becoming stuck solely in their adult because their inner child is just simply too scared to play or show itself. Because, like the parent in the example before that was shaming of the child, the parent in this person's personality will not let them access their child. It will not let them play. So being stuck in adult, it can have its advantages because it makes people hard workers. But the disadvantages of this are going to be because working and being so serious is the only way they know how to be in the world. They're not going to be able to stop to play or relax. So this is going to put them at risk of becoming workaholics and possibly damaging relationships too, because they just won't be able to commit time to activities that don't revolve around work, and that's not going to make it fun for families to be around. Often people who are stuck in their adult in later life can turn to alcohol as a means of trying to regulate their system because they've got no inner parent to soothe. Sometimes a drug or a chemical will do that, and that can obviously lead to addiction. So another example would be children who are brought up by parents who are locked in a child ego state themselves. So this would be people who have literally no adult and parent in their personality. They'll be very childlike, who have had children, because these child parents, they can't possibly know all the best ways to meet the needs of their children as they develop, which means that their children are likely to develop some sort of anxious, disorganized, or avoidant attachment style, especially if the child ego state of the actual parent is self-serving and more focused on meeting its own needs than those of its child. Which you can imagine, can't you? If someone was stuck in their 2, 3, 4 year old ego state, there's no way that person is going to be prioritizing the needs of others. They haven't had their own needs met. So they're probably even going to be feel resentful that they've got to look after other people. So, in effect, parents who are constantly in a child ego state often leave their own children in a sort of, if I didn't get it given to me, then how am I supposed to know how to give it to myself situation, which can leave them as adults continuously searching for the parent and care that they didn't get in childhood. They're probably going to be prioritizing that search for that soulmate, that unconditional giving person who's going to meet all of those needs. And they're probably going to prioritize that over more healthier adult activities like careers and just regulating their own emotions. So you can often see the influence of the child, the adult, and the parent ego states in others. And while it's important that we can recognize these traits in those around us, it's more important that we can see the influences of our own ego states within ourselves. Because if we can do that, we can then work to recognize which of our ego states need to be developed to enable us to make more grown up choices that might make us choose better relationships, feel safer or happier in the world. There'll be so many different options. So understanding the principles of TAs it's a useful way to do this. But the trouble is, if you're largely in your child or in a parent or adult ego state that's not functioning as it should, then it's going to take time to implement change, as we're going to need to rewire some of those old ways of being. And that's a process, not an event. So if we think about it logically, to develop the parent ego state, we need to get better at building up internal reassurance resources, which is the opposite of what we're typically doing to ourselves if we have deficiencies in our parent. So if we can get better at doing this, then we're going to be working towards installing a counter argument to challenge the intrusive thoughts that make us believe that we deserve to feel unnecessary levels of certain negative emotions. But if you've been shamed or guilted as a child, the trouble that you're going to have is that your pre-existing ego states are going to try to remain in control, and they're going to try to continue to generate those feelings, even though the feelings are negative, because that's the only way that part of your brain knows how to sort of survive in the world, because they're so used to the shame, it isn't going to want to let go of it, which means that your existing process is going to be resistant to change, even if it's healthy change. And this is going to be something you're going to have to be very mindful of. Usually a good way to get the ball rolling is to start prioritizing development of the adult, which means we need to start analyzing any negative feelings that we experience on a daily basis, really make a habit of this. So if, for example, we're feeling shame, then we need to be stepping into adult and asking ourselves why we're feeling shame and what purpose is it serving. Is it because we've done something bad? Or could it be because we were made to feel bad as children? Is it a habit? Is this what we always go to? But if you have done something to warrant the emotion, then we need to use the adult to understand why we did it, what we got from the action other than the shame. So we need to be having these conversations with ourselves, because that's what the adult does. It rationalizes, it thinks, it plans, it works stuff out. And once we've got the adult rolling with that, then we can use the parent to work towards making amends with ourselves and others, if necessary, while putting ourselves in a place where we can sort of grow boundaries with ourselves, so we can stop putting ourselves in that position again, because why would we want to? So like I said earlier, there's going to be resistance to change with this, and our psychological process might even invite us to do shameful or improper behavior so we can sabotage that change and maintain the belief that we deserve to feel whatever it is that's figural to us. So if this is the case, then the adult ego state needs to be working on understanding this and figuring this out, because it needs to understand those connections, because nothing good's going to come from manufacturing negative emotions. The only reason that is happening is because your process wants to remain with what it knows. It doesn't want to change. So if you think about how the shamed child developed a critical parent ego state by being repeatedly shamed, by focusing on giving ourselves logic and reassurance, what we're working on doing is reprogramming our brain to think how we want it to function, rather than how other people made it function with their inappropriate parent styles, or how it's responding as a result of PTSD. So another useful thing to remember is to try to recognize which ego state you're in at any given period. Because if you can do that, then you can realize if you're in the appropriate ego state. Because you don't want to be making a presentation to your boss if in your child ego state. You need to be in your adult one for that. So you're with your strength, you're with your confidence. So you need to bring the parent in to reassure the child that you're okay to do this presentation. Then the adult can leave the child in the back and it can step onto the stage. Also, we need to be mindful of how we might be slipping into different ego states around different people, depending on what ego state they're in. So, I mean, an example of this, where if you were shamed as a child, you might go into child ego state around anybody who's shaming. So, switching between ego states is going to be happening to us all of the time, and that's absolutely normal. It's just our process switching to the ego state that it thinks will be most useful for dealing with that situation. And of course, this is okay if our ego states are working healthily. But if they're not, then we need to grow some adult awareness of this, so we can work towards giving ourselves better choices in those situations, because we don't just want to be left with the shame, the guilt, the fear, the anger. So it's also useful if you can try to pinpoint the age and the function of the ego state that you're in at that given time. Because if you can do that, you can get better at giving yourself alternative choices. And working on pinpointing this is an adult process. So the more of this you can think about and analyze, how old am I feeling in this moment? Why have I gone into the child? That's an adult process. So you're in your logical part of the brain. So that's already going to be helping you step out of child. So people with CPTSD can also benefit from the same approach, because, as we said earlier, their adult and their parent ego states are misfunctioning due to the trauma. So working to bring those ego states back into place is going to help them to reduce the excessive feelings being triggered by the hypervigilant state. From then on, it's about them over time building the parent to regulate the feelings in general. So people with CPTSD definitely to be working on the adult, the logic, and then typically it gets easier after the logic is stronger to bring in the parent. So if you're really stuck in child and have very little access to parent or adult, or you're absolutely stuck in CPTSD, then you're probably best seeking out help from a counsellor or a psychotherapist who uses the TA model, because over time they're going to model the healthy adult and the healthy parent ego states for you while helping you understand options you have with your ego state reactions. So that's going to really help you over time to apply some of the principles of TA to your process. So there are lots of levels to TA that we could go into, such as how the functioning of our ego states can influence our partner or friendship choices, because this is a really interesting one as well. Because if we're brought up in a certain environment which all our ego states were attuned to, then we're going to maybe be drawn to similar environments as adults, which could be dangerous if those early environments were neglectful, traumatizing, abusive. So that's another area that's really useful to be thinking about. And also we need to think about how the child ego state also has a child, an adult, and a parent within as well, because it has to be, if you think logically about it, because as the child's developing, it starts to learn how to look after itself. So that's when the parent starts to do it. And when it starts to think a bit more logically, because it starts to understand things, that's its developing adult. So this is another thing we can think about, because if we're deciding, am I in my adult parent or parent at this moment, we need to maybe think, am I in the adult of my adult, or am I in the adult of my child? Because the person who's like we said earlier, the workaholic is probably in the adult of their child, because a healthy adult wouldn't be making them work. It would be able to step into parent and relax after a hard day's work and reassure itself it's done a good job. It can put its feet up. So you'd think people like that are probably stuck in the adult of their child. So these are things that I'll probably do another video on, because they're big subject, but they're useful subjects to understand as well. Well, hopefully the video's been interesting and useful for you. And if you want me to discuss any areas of it in a little more detail, just message me in the comments and I'll see if I can do your video. But thanks for watching and take care. Goodbye.